evening.
Shalom Aleichem, Rabbi Sai.
Hi, Rabbi Hartman.
Hi.
I just wonder if there's been a slight misunderstanding. I think we had the Rav down for next week.
I'm sorry?
I think there may have been a slight misunderstanding. I think we had the Rav down for next week rather than this week.
Well, I think that was a misunderstanding. And Rabbi Kirsch is going to be speaking now.
Yes, indeed.
Good. It helps me a tremendous. So we had a misunderstanding.
Yes.
But I'm going to stay immediately. But I'm going to hear Rabbi Kirsch at least in the first couple of minutes. I want to hear. Okay, no problem. No problem, guys.
Apologies about that. Okay, so
no, it's my mistake.
Let's get started then. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the first of our series of ELUL and TISHREI Monday Night Shiurim. We hope, please God, to be having a shir each week over the coming few weeks through Chol Hamoed Sukkot, aside from on Motzei Yom Kippur, and also on a Motzei Tzom Gedalia will be at 9 p.m. We're delighted this evening to be joined by Rabbi Kirsch of the JLE. And for anyone who didn't see the email, please do try and get hold of the Siddur and Chumash to follow along. And without further ado, I will hand over to Rabbi Kirsch.
Thank you once again for the opportunity to share Divrei Torah with you, especially because it was nearly 5 months plus ago when I had the opportunity to begin my Zoom career through Ner Yisrael. Thank you, Aaron, for inviting me then, when we gave a shir pre-Pesach. And we look forward to an exciting new world ahead, where I'll be having the chance to sit in front of you face to face without any electronic equipment interrupting between us. Chazal tell us that certain sedras are always found and finished before certain times of the year. Ezra was masaking that b'chukosai. We always make sure that we finish those klolas before Shavuos. And this week's sedra Kisovai is always said before Rosh Hashanah. And of course, we see that as a reality that sadly much of Kisovai has a reminder of what happens where we go wrong. I'd like to suggest another interesting idea, and that is connect an aspect of Kisovai to Rosh Hashanah itself, but not about the chastisements of the Jewish people, but rather I'd like to look at the concept of Viduy, what I need to do to come home, what I need to do to correct myself. And interesting enough, in this week's Sedra, Parshas Kisovai, chapter 26, if you have an art scroll, it's 1068, chapter 26 begins with Bikurim. Of course, we've had mention of Bikurim earlier in the Torah, in Parshas Mishpatim, but here, as we're going to see later in the Sefer Chinuch, here there's another dimension which is being taught. And in fact, that dimension which is being taught has a fascinating description to it. The Torah tells us, Uvosol HaKaren, that once you will go to the land of Israel and you'll be blessed with the incredible blessings that the land of Israel gives you, you will take some of those blessings, the first fruits, and you'll bring them to Yerushalayim, and you'll come to the Kohen, who in your days, Ramatelav, and you'll say to him, etc., etc. And you'll give over the special Arami Aravidovi, which, as I mentioned a little earlier, was my connection, of course, to this Zooming, because it was Arami Aravidovi, our conversation, our description about the Haggadah, so much of which comes from that line. But interesting enough, the language of the Rambam, when he's describing this mitzvah, and this is found in Hilchos Bikurim, Perek Gimel, Halacha Yud, the Rambam, in describing the mitzvah of Bikurim, says amazingly, mitzvahs are say lehisvadois b'mikdash. There's an obligation to do viduy, to do a confession in the Beis Hamikdash. When you bring the Gemara Bikurim, the description which is being given here is it's a viduy Bikurim. And the question I'd like to ask myself today and ask all of you is, what's the connection between bringing Bikurim and a viduy, a confession? What's the connection between that and the obligation to make this declaration, which is known as a confession? That's question number one. Now, I'm going to share with you 4 or 5 questions, and I very much hope that everybody stays with me to the end. Otherwise, you may well be left with the questions, and I'd love to give you the opportunity to hear the answers. Question number 2. Later on, the next Parsha in this week's Sedra, which begins with Sheni, is a new obligation. Again, an obligation to Eretz Yisrael, There's biblical obligations to tithe your produce, particular produce of the land of Eretz Yisrael. Of course, we know that the agricultural years are divided into the 6 years of work and the 7th year of Shemitah. What we also need to know is B'Shana Hashlishis, in the 3rd year of that cycle, you need to do a special process. At the end of that 3rd year, likewise, you have to stand in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as if to say, and you have to do Bi'ate HaKodesh Min Habayis. You have to make a description that you have removed all of the holy things, meaning that I fulfill my obligation. Not only have I given Truma, and not only have I given Ma'aser Rishon, but I was also given the Ma'aser Sheni, which I have an obligation 2 years out of the 3 to eat in Yerushalayim, and I've given the Ma'aser Oni as well. And amazingly, how do Chazal describe V'amata? I have the obligation to come and tell the story about my having fulfilled my obligations and given all of my Trumas and Maasers. Well, says Rashi, you have to be the Kver Zman Habia V'havidoy. You come out and you do a thing called Viduy Maasros, the confession of Maasros. Now, I thought Viduy was all about confessing about my sins. Here I've seen in the Rambam, in terms of Bikurim, the language of Viduy is used to describe the declaration I make when I bring my Bikurim. And now I'm seeing that the Viduy is being used, as Chazal tell us, there's a Viduy Maasros in the 2nd mitzvah. At the end of every 3rd year, at the beginning of the 4th year, on Erev Pesach, I have the obligation in the 4th year on Erev Pesach to do Viduy Maasros. Viduy, confession. No al-chetz over here, yet the language Viduy is used. So amazingly, before Rosh Hashanah, before Yom Kippur, we will read Parshas Kisova, and that means there's just a couple of weeks to go, friends. Before then, we will read the Parsha of Kisova, and the first 2 mitzvahs contain the language of Viduy. What lessons can be learned from that language? What messages are inherent in there? And since we're talking about Viduy, I'd like to ask 2 more questions. Question number 3, for that you're going to have to go to Vayikra. And I don't know if any of you remember the old Yellow Pages advert, which was, let your fingers do the walking. And today, to keep everybody wide awake, our fingers will scan throughout the Chumshei Torah. We started just now with Devarim. Let's go back to Vayikra, chapter 5, Posuk 5. Chapter 5, Posuk 5. Parshas Vayikra, Sefer Vayikra. And there we're talking about an osham, a guilt offering. We may speak a little bit about why a person would bring such an offering, but that's one of the Makaros where we have the language of Viduy. Viduy, which we'll be saying very often between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Viduy, which we'll repeat many times over Yom Kippur itself. Where does that language come from? Well, one of the Makaros is chapter 5, verse 5. V'hoya, and it will be ki ye'eh sham la'achas me'ela, that when a person is guilty of one of the previously mentioned mistakes, they said something incorrectly, they made a promise, they didn't keep it, v'hisvada, and he shall make a confession, asher chota oleh, on that area which he has sinned. V'hisvada, and he shall make a confession. Well, that's a word we recognize, Viduy. The only thing is that if we have some people who spend a little bit of time understanding grammar, we will get a bit of a surprise. Because if you look at the word v'hisvada and you ask yourself what its grammatical understanding, it would probably be best translated is that he does Viduy to himself. In other words, it's reflexive. Now, I always thought the Viduy is to God, Oshamnu, Bagonnu, Gazalnu. Yet this is one of the places used to describe the language of Viduy. And in fact, nearly everywhere, as we're going to see, when we mention the word Viduy, and it's specifically mentioned in the text, V'hisvada, it's actually more often than not in the reflexive, which means that we are admitting, we are confessing to ourselves, which is a little strange. Now, the Rambam in Hilchos Teshuvah, and this comes to my 4th question, and I hope everybody's with me, and I'll repeat the questions as we go through them in a minute. The Rambam in Hilchos Teshuvah, at the very opening to the laws of Teshuvah. And by the way, even though the tradition is to learn Hilchos Teshuvah during the month of Elul, and it's a great time to focus on it, nevertheless, the mitzvah of Teshuvah is a mitzvah throughout our lives, every day of our lives. And every time we do something incorrect, the sooner we do Teshuvah and correct it, the better. As we know, there's a special power and energy which exists between Rosh Hashanah, particularly Yom Kippur, and that's why people focus greatly. But this Sefer, Hilchos Teshuvah, can be learnt and acquired at any local bookshop, not only during the month of Elul, but 365 days during the year. Kol mitzvahs Shabbat Torah, says the Rambam. All mitzvahs in the Torah, ben aseh or ben lo aseh, whether they're positive or negative, if a person breaks one of them, ben b'zolem, ben b'shogeg, on purpose or by mistake, when they do tshuva and they correct the mistake they've done, chayav lihisvados, they need to do teshuva. Lifnei hakel baruch hu, in front of God. They need to do viduy, in front of Hashem. Post tshuva comes viduy. Now, before I bring the posuk which he quotes, just to point out that in the introduction to Hilchos Tshuva, we actually find that there was one mitzvah which the Rambam focuses on. And in the introduction to Hilchos Tshuva, the language which is brought is mitzvah aseh achas hi sheyoshev achoit mechata lifnei Hashem v'yisvada. There's one mitzvah in the entire book of Hilchos Tshuva, and that is that after a person has returned from their sin, there's an obligation to say viduy. And now we're going to go into that mitzvah. One mitzvah in Hilchos Tshuva. Obviously, any aveira that we do, we have to correct. That's given. Any missed opportunity that we lost, we didn't put on tefillin today, we didn't do a mitzvah aseh we should have done. Of course we have to correct it. What the Hilchos Tshuva is adding to that is the particular biblical obligation of hisvada es chatosom is to do viduy, to do our confession. And the Rambam brings a posuk, and the posuk that he brings is in chapter 5 of Bamidbar, Parshas Nosai. Chapter 5 of Bamitzvah, which is found in Parshas Nosai, and we're looking now at posuk 6 and 7. These are the posukim that the Rambam quotes. If you have a chumash nearby, we're now into Bamidbar. And there the Rambam says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, and there the Torah says, Daber el b'nei Yisrael, ish rishor ki yaseh mikol chatzos ha'odem, limol ma'al Hashem v'ashor ma'nefesh hahu, which translated means that there's, Hashem says, speak to the entire Jewish people and say, a man or woman who does any of a person's sins. In other words, the posuk tells us very, very clearly, mikol, from any of the sins which are done, that what is a person obligated to do? In verse 6, v'hisvadu es chatoson, they shall confess their sin that they committed. And then it goes on to say, and this is in reference to correcting, giving the appropriate additional amount, or giving the appropriate amount back. The posuk in 6 says, v'hisvadu es chatosam asher osu v'heishiv es hashama, which translated says, they shall confess their sin that they committed, collective, they shall confess their sin that they committed. He shall make restitution for his guilt. And Zalman Sorotskin asked the following question. Yes, we learn from here that there's an obligation for any sin that a person does that they have to confess. But what's fascinating in the next posuk, immediately following the obligation to do confession, is the posuk says, he shall make restitution for his guilt. Ask Rav Zalman Sorotskin, if the obligation to viduy is on everybody, why doesn't the verse then talk about everybody needing to make restitution for all of their guilt? This is a question asked by Rav Zalman Sorotskin, and I know some of you have got questions on that question. But nevertheless, the 4 questions, therefore, I'd like to share with you today. And again, our introduction to Parshas Bikurim, because every time there is a Sedra close to Yom Tov, the Sedra highlights issues that we can learn with and appreciate the Yom Tov. As we say, Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, Viduy will soon be upon us. Question number 1 is, what is the connection between Bikurim and Viduy? Question number 2 is, what is the question between the obligation to do the Bia of Maisrus in the 4th year, Viduy Maisrus? Why is that called Viduy Maisrus, a confession of Maisrus? Next, why is a hisvada, as we found it in Bamidbar, and it's also found in Vayikra as well, why is it the hisvada, which is reflexive, to speak to yourself? And finally, as Naim the Torah's interesting idea is, what's the connection between the fact that there's a plural followed by a singular in the posuk, which is the one that the Rambam happens to quote in terms of our obligation? So there's some questions for us, and let's try and go on our journey and try and consider them. Now, if we start, if we can, on the language of Viduy, which is used by the Rambam in the obligations of bringing Bikurim. Interesting enough, this Sefer Chinuch, as we mentioned in Parshas Mishpatim, gives us a little insight as to what is the overall purpose, as if to say, if you could use this word, for Bikurim. Now, we don't have a time to go into this in detail now. However, I highly recommend to look through the Meforshim to really understand the obligation of Bikurim and the ongoing obligation that we have to live up to the principles of Bikurim, even though we can't give Bikurim today. Because the Rambam tells us as follows, that a person, when they look at the blessings that they've been endowed with, when they look at the blessings which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given to them, after all, this is Kisover Ela Oretz, and as we'll see in the Viduy, which is being said, Arami Ovid, we'll tell a history of where we've come from and what we've been through, and the opportunity we now have to give those thanks, says the Ram, the Chinuch. Al Kain Itzavonu Lahavi, therefore we are commanded to bring, as we are the servants of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and come to his house, and we bring with us Reishis Hapri, those beautiful fruits that have ripened on the trees. Umitoch Haskir v'Kabbalas Malchuso, and at this moment we'll begin to remember and accept HaKadosh Baruch Hu as our sovereign. What strong Rosh Hashanah language is. As we go to his home and we thank Hashem for everything, we recognize him as the sovereign over our lives. And we acknowledge, we thank Hashem for the produce and all the good that Hashem has given to us. Says the Chinuch, and of course he references it to Bikurim, but what a message for all of us. That every so often we need to take a stock take. Every so often we need to stop, stand in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, thank you, thank you, thank you. Not only do we stand in front of Hashem with a list of requests, we stand in front of Hashem with a list of gratitudes, of acknowledgements. And I have a very close and dear friend of mine who, on a daily basis, has a list of the things he wants to say thank you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for. Bereshis bara Elokim, bishvil reishis, bishvil bikurim, shenikra reishis. Say the Meforshim, this underlying principle, hakarat hatov, of recognition of good, of acknowledgement of good, is a central message, says the Chinuch, of our obligation to bring those bikurim, and as we added, throughout our lives, to take that message home to us. It seems from the language of the Chinuch that he translates the language of that we should say hodotanu, we should acknowledge. And if you look in the Meforshim, they will say that the word viduy is connected to the word acknowledge. Interesting enough, if a person is in court and they decided to plead guilty, or they plead to a percentage of what it was, you owe me 100. I agree I owe you, but I only owe you 50. They are modeh b'mixus. Modeh b'mixus means they acknowledge that they owe something. Say the commentators, the word modeh, to acknowledge, is the root of the word viduy. The beginning of our confession means to be acknowledging. In this case of Bikurim, it's acknowledging our blessings come to God, from God. And in our translation of viduy, and of course it's connected to the word todah. And as we wake up in the morning, we say, Modeh ani lefanecha, thank you. What's the connection between acknowledgement and thank you? The connection, of course, is that gratitude is in response to our acknowledgement of what it is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given us. I have an inordinary sense of gratitude to God once I acknowledge what it is that God has given me. And of course, Moedim anachnu loch al nisecho shebechol yomimonu v'al niflosecho v'tovesecho sheb. When we're saying moed, it's a sort of viduy, but it's a different viduy that we've learned up until now in our lives. We're not saying I'm sorry, we're saying I'm grateful. We're acknowledging what it is Hashem has given to us. And interesting enough, the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, when he looks at this mitzvah of Bikurim, and you may want to now return to the language which we saw in our Parshas Kisova, says the Orach Chaim HaKodesh, in Pasuk Hey, we say, V'onis, on chapter 26, Pasuk Hey in Parshas Kisova, we say, V'onisa v'ormata. We say the following language. You should call out v'ormata, and you should say Lifnei Hashem. The Orach Chaim HaKodesh is fascinated by this language, v'onisa, you should call out. Says Orach Chaim HaKodesh, this language can also be understood as following. That when an undeserving individual, says the Orach Chaim, has received a great favor from his king, v'onisa, he humbles himself before his king. V'onisa, from the language oni, not only calling out, not only saying in front of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but oni, acting with humility. And that person who stands in front of Hashem, aware of all the good that's been done to him, has that sense of humility, the contrite heart, say our rabbis, and that's exactly how we should be saying Viduy. When we say Viduy, our own confession, it's an acknowledgement of what we've done wrong and missed opportunities that we haven't fulfilled, and it should be done va'oniso, with a contrite heart. Interesting enough, the chinuch in mitzvah 606 on this week's Sedra, the Sefer Chinuch on our Sedra, again, just to make it very clear, in Parshas Mishpatim it mentions the mitzvah Bikurim, but in our Sedra it goes into greater detail, and we have the mitzvah, as the Rambam describes it, as Viduy Bikurim, the declaration. In the Mishpatim it's an obligation to give Bikurim, and in our Sedra it's a detailed description of what we say when we give it and how we give it as well. Says the Chinuch, what is the purpose of the mitzvah of saying, speaking the Viduy Bikurim? Says the Sefer Chinuch, Al Kain Tzavenu Lahavi, therefore, the Chinuch tells us, Lefi Sha'odem Ma'arav Machshavtai, because a person will awaken their thoughts, Umitztai Belibai, and they will think about the emes, the truth, when B'karch Divrei Piv, when they speak things out aloud. Says the Chinuch, on this mitzvah in our week Sedra, why do you have to enunciate? Why do you have to pronounce? Why do you have to speak? After all, God knows how I feel. God knows my thoughts. Says the Chinuch, because when you speak something out, when you talk it out, it has a far greater effect on acting upon it and has a deeper effect on you. And the Chinuch goes on to explain the centrality not just of bringing the Bikurim, but talking through the gift of the Bikurim and talking through the history of the Jewish people. And how pertinent and relevant to us that when we fulfill and do the mitzvah of proper Viduy, you have to talk it out. Oshamnu, bogarnu, gozalnu. Not that my neighbor can hear all the intricate details of the sins I've done, because the Rambam says the more details the better, but that I can hear, and I need to say it out aloud so that I know exactly what I'm saying. Interesting enough, the Mishnah in Bikurim, which is speaking about the mitzvah of bringing the Bikurim and how to do it, the Mishnah in Perik Gimel of Mishnah Bikurim, and now we turn to Perik Gimel Mishnah Aleph, asks us the question, Ketzad Mafrishim HaBikurim, how do you separate the Bikurim? And the Mishnah goes on that a person goes out to the field and they see a ta'ena, etc., etc. They see a fig which is just growing. They say eshkol which are growing. They say rimon which are growing. They see figs. They say grapes. They say pomegranates are growing. At that stage, they put a little tie around it and they say, Hare elu bikurim. These are my first fruits. ask the Ben Ish Chai the following question. I don't understand. There are other fruits you have an obligation to bring beyond the 3 which are mentioned in the Mishnah. There's more you have to do than just bringing your figs, your grapes, and your pomegranates. What about your olives? What about your dates? And he asks us to look in Parshas Shalach, in Bamidbar, Parshas Shalach, Posuk Yud Gimel. Says the Ben Ish Chai, why does the Mishnah specify those 3 things? On Posuk Perek Yud Gimel, Posuk Chaf Gimel, it tells the story of the spies. Vayovo ad Nachal Eshkol, and the spies, the 10 bad spies, came to Nachal Eshkol, and they cut down from there grapes, and they took pomegranates, and they took figs. The pasuk that describes the first journey into Eretz Yisrael and the sin of the spies mentions grapes, figs, and pomegranates. Says the Ben Ish Chai, when we're recording the Bikurim in the Mishnah, we mention grapes, figs, and pomegranates because the mitzvah of Bikurim is to correct the Aveira of the spies. It's a tikkun for our abuse and misuse of the opportunities and blessings the Almighty has given us. And therefore, the first 3 things we put the tie around are the specific 3 things that we sinned about when we spoke. And of course, we know that the Rambam says in Hilchos Tshuva that the greatest Tshuva is to put yourself back into the position that you were in and when you did the Aveira and correct it. When I confront grapes again, when I confront figs again, I will correct the mistakes which were made by the spies all those years ago. And one other message that we can see about the concept of doing teshuvah and correcting our mistakes. In Pasuk Gimel, in Parshas Kisavo, Uvosol HaKaren, and you shall come to the Karen Asher Yeh Bayomim Mahem, who is in your days, Ramatalav Higadata Yom LaHashem, and you should say to him that today I'm coming and I'm standing in front of you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I come to him and I say that today, and then I make my declaration, say them before Hashem. Why does I have to say today? This was written thousands of years ago. Why do I have to say today? Say them before Hashem because there's an obligation every single day of our life to show this gratitude. Every single day. Yes, there's a time when I'm saying right now, I'm standing here in front of you today. But when we say those words, Hayom, we're reminding ourselves of our daily obligations. As the Chofetz Chaim says, in our Shema, we say, these words which I command to you today should be upon your heart. Says the Chofetz Chaim, I command you today because today must be different from yesterday. And today must be different from tomorrow. There's a today in our lives where I have obligation to do tshuva. There's a today where I miss the opportunities which HaKadosh Baruch Hu has given me. Yes, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are times for teshuva, but every day is a time to reflect on our blessings and the opportunities. Now we jump onto Viduy Maestris. And in Viduy Maestris, the Abal Benel draws our attention to why that language of Viduy Maestris is particularly used. What's the concept of Viduy Maestris? Now, we may have a number of accountants with us at the moment, and we wish you a truly blessed year. And of course, having accountants with us reminds us of the profit and loss account that we too have got to ensure that we're very much in profit and we're overcoming loss. And that our predictions are not going stale, but we're really, please God, ensuring that our assets are much greater than our liabilities. The Abal Benel says there's a bit of accounting which needs to do by the Viduy Maestris, which means that the farmer needs to look at his crop and decide how much he needs to give of his crop in the tithes, how much he needs to take to give as Maaseh Sheni, take to Shleim, how much he needs to give to Maaseh Oni. But says the Abal Benel, the most extraordinary thing, that there's nobody who knows except HaKadosh Baruch Hu what my fiscal obligation is. There's nobody going around to my house and checking that, oh, he produced 100 bushels, and therefore he's got an obligation to give 2 to the Kohen, 10 to the Levi, another percentage to Maaseh Sheni on the 3rd year, etc., 2 to Maaseh Oni. There's nobody who knows and who's going around to check. This is what is known as self-evaluation. This is known in the tax language of you tell the Inland Revenue what you earned. Nobody's going to come and check your books. Says the Abarbanel, and that is why one of the reasons why we call it Viduy, confession. Listen to the frightening words that he uses. Because I have to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows that I know. Meaning, when I'm standing in front of Kadosh Baruch Hu, I have to know that it's Viduy in front of Hashem, that I know he knows exactly how many apples and pears I had, and I know he knows what my obligation is, and I can turn to Hashem and I said, I've done everything I'm supposed to, and I'm doing everything correctly. What a frightening madrega of Viduy, that I'm confessing that I've done what I'm supposed to do, and I know that the only being in the world who truly knows whether I'm telling the truth is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Says the Abarbanel, that is the message of the self-assessment of the Viduy Maasros. The Sifano adds another dimension, and he says there's a very profound message which is found in Viduy Maasros, where when we bring and we say our Viduy Maasros, we say the following powerful language. We say that I've done everything I'm supposed to do, and I've done it the correct way. In Pasuk Yud Dalet, Lo achalti banim mimeni. When it came to eating the food, I didn't eat any of the food while I was mourning. Velo ba'ati mimeni b'tamei, and I didn't eat any of the food incorrectly. I've done everything that I'm supposed to do, and I've done it in exactly the correct way. In Pasuk Yagimel, we say, "Ba'arti hakodesh min habayit." I've removed everything that's holy from my house. Says the Sipano, I've removed everything that's holy from my house. I've done everything correctly. What's the language of removed everything holy from my house? Says the Sipano. Unfortunately, it's a reminder of the sin that we did at the sin of the golden calf. Why is it that's a reminder? And by the way, the Rambam brings the sin of the golden calf specifically in the laws of Teshuvah, when he says there that when you do Viduy, you have to be absolutely specific about the sin which was done. As the language which is given by the Rambam, that the sin that we did has to be specified. And that specification which is brought, he brings a posuk from the sin of the golden calf. As a result of the sin of the golden calf, it wasn't that in my own home I had a Kohen. Pre-golden calf, every Jewish family would have their own in-house Kohanim. We'd be, as if to say, giving the tithe to ourselves constantly. And we'd be supporting our own family as they would be the firstborn in Yerushalayim, looking after and caring for the Korbanos. But sadly, as a result of the sin of the golden calf, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayis, the sanctity that was once mine in the home, has sadly left me. When I go and I bring that crop, when I bring the fruit, and in the fourth year I do the Viduy, I remind myself that sadly, I have to bring it now to the Kohanim, but I could have been that Kohen if I wouldn't have done the Aveira at the golden calf. And therefore we find ourselves surrounded by Viduy, surrounded by the messages of the obligation. And by the way, Reb Chaim Vital, when he's talking about the tshuva which is necessary in one's own home, points out, says Reb Chaim Vital, that people think that they've been so holy outside the home, they gave charity, they were seen as a good person giving loan, but in their own home, with their own husband and wife, with their own children, they haven't behaved themselves. Said Reb Chaim Vital, the ultimate view from HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to be taken on exactly how we behave in our home. When we bring the Maasros, we say, Bi'arti HaKodesh min habayis. Unfortunately, my home isn't as it should be, isn't as it could be. Now, just before I carry on and I look at some of the other languages that we looked at, I don't know, Mr. Lovett, if you want to take any little questions briefly before we spend the next 10, 15 minutes just giving the last couple of ideas.
Sure, if anyone wants to unmute themselves and ask something, please do.
Looks like we're doing fine. Good. So there's no unmuting, so we can carry on. And it's Rabbi Kirsch at jli.org.uk, should anybody want to send in a question. Let's now get on to Vayikra Hey Hey, where the actual language of Viduy is being used. So we've spoken about the language of acknowledgement. We've spoken about Viduy being a language of self-assessment. Now let's have a look at the question we asked about lehis vadois, the language of really saying something to yourself, because we've said that that language is a language which is reflexive. And here I'd like to read to you the words of Rabbi Samson for Hirsch, and please excuse me for reading such a large chunk of 6-7 of his lines. Says Rav Hirsch on that verse, chapter 5, verse 5 in Vayikra, the mitzvah of Viduy appears almost always in the reflexive. His vadah, not to another person must the sinner confess his sin. Essentially, listen to this language of Rabbi Hirsch, it's not even to God, as God knows the sin and does not need the confession. Now, this needs further clarification because, of course, we are saying it to God. And, of course, we're apologizing to God. But listen to how Rav Hirsch puts it, and you can please look this up in your own time. The sinner's, rather to himself, must the sinner admit that he has sinned. First and foremost, Viduy is the sinner's admission to himself is his first step towards mending his ways. V'his vadah. Indeed, one may not bring an offering unless he has resolved to correct his ways. So you have teshuvah, correction, v'his vadah, and Viduy. It starts and finishes with a reflection of I'm talking to myself. As the Kotzker says, everybody knows it's a biblical obligation to be true with other people. We would hope we would take it for granted that there's a biblical obligation to be true to yourself. Now, it's very embarrassing for me to talk here today, and I've prepared this shir for you only because Mr. Lavid asked me, or Aaron asked me to prepare the shir, but we're all in this together. The most embarrassing thing at this time of year is to have to face ourselves. V'his vadah. And the Rabbeinu Bechaya adds another dimension to this aspect of it. Says the Rabbeinu Bechaya on this posuk, a very big chiddush, but nevertheless worth looking at. V'his vadah asher chot aleh. I'll translate his words. We were talking, because we're talking about an ashram, we're talking about somebody who's in doubt. Did they, in the particular mitzvah we're referring to, they're in doubt. Did they commit an error or did they not? Are they obligated or not? And then on a close examination, they find out that in fact they did commit the sin. Says the Rabbeinu Bechaya, this is hinted in the word v'his vadah because it's choser levadai. Amazing language of Rabbeinu Bechaya, that the word Viduy is connected to the word vadai, certainty. I know that I am wrong. I know I am incorrect. And by the way, our friends, the more we honestly admit to our shortcomings, vadai, the more we're able to do Viduy. Big chiddush of the Rabbeinu Bechaya, but nevertheless the language which he uses. I mentioned that in the language of the other example which we brought, which is the language which the Rambam himself brings, the Zalman Sorotzkin speaks about the posuk which seems to talk about they will confess and he will make restitution. And again, when we have more time, we need to see the context in which that is written in Bamidbar, Perek Hey, Posuk Vav and Zayin, exactly what the factors is. But Rav Zalman Sorotzkin says a frightening language where he's talking about this, and he talks about the fact that they shall confess, but then the next point points out he shall make restitution. And again, you need to look at this in greater detail. Says Rav Zalman Sorotzkin, this corresponds to the way of the world, sadly, I'm adding that word, because many people confess, but when it comes to correcting it, returning the money, we have only 1 in 1,000 actually follow it through. In other words, they shall confess and he shall make the restitution. Yes, I'm wrong. Yes, I owe you. Yes, I should be giving it to you. But how many people collectively do the things that they say they're going to do? And he hints at the fact that we then move on to the individual, because many will confess in Yom Kippur and promise, but those who keep the promise are few. So we began a fascinating journey today in the 3/4 of an hour, which is allowed to us. We began the journey that Viduy actually comes in our Seder and is connected to admittance and it's connected to the concept of acknowledgement. Probably the root is a Yud Dalet Hey of the word of Viduy. And then we said that it needs to be done from the obligation of Bikurim in a verbal way. Again, Chazal learned this, the obligation to do it out aloud from various places. But one of the principles I'm learning out from Bikurim, we're learning out from Bikurim, is Bikurim had to be verbalized. It's not enough to think it. And only through talking it out, verbalization, can a person internalize it correctly. To connect the past, and we say the obligation is to focus on my sins of today. We have to know when we say Viduy, and we have to believe that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows. And it's very interesting that, of course, that before the Viduy of Yom Kippur and the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, we have that language of seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the king. And we mentioned earlier from the language of the Chinuch that when we realize all that the king has done for us, and we're standing in front of the king, we should also add the other dimension, which is the obligation to understand and appreciate that that's in fact who we're speaking to. So, and finally, this absolute sense that we need to be honest with ourselves at all times and realize with clarity that we've done the things wrong. Now, it's a heavy share because ultimately Rosh Hashanah is heavy as well. And one of the questioners has sent in a little question to me. And the question was, I understand you have to enumerate one's averos and be honest with yourself, but what if you don't remember everything wrong you have done? It's worrying. What should a person do? So the good news is that in the actual language of the Viduy, there's a bit of a catch-all where we say to the Almighty, all those things that I've said, please forgive me for the things which I know about. And for those things I don't know about, which sadly, for one reason, I'm not clear, and there are many things we don't know about, and there are many things we don't realize the ramifications of what we've done as well. We ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to give us a kapara, even though we aren't able to specify all of those things. And therefore, there is a sort of catch-all language which we use in our Viduy. However, it's very, very clear from Chazal, it's very clear from the Rishonim, the Achronim, that the more we can be clear, the more honest we are, the more that we can specify Harizeh Meshubach. And interestingly enough, the Ashamnu Bogadnu that we say goes to the Aleph base. And the Meforshim explain that it shouldn't simply be a language of Aleph base in terms of just going through the alphabet, but actually we should think to ourselves all the Alephs and all the bases that we have done in our lives so that we can be much more specific for the error. Somebody else asked me the question, what did I mean when I said that every family had a Kohen in their own household? That pre the sin of the golden calf, there was no such thing as the tribe of Levi being specifically the Kohanim. The tribe of Levi only being the ones who are allowed to work in the Beis Hamikdash. Before the sin of the golden calf, every family had its own in-house Kohanim, who, had it not been for the sin of the golden calf, would be the ones who would be representing them in the temple. As a sin of the golden calf, unfortunately, that was passed on to the Kohanim, and etc., etc. So, Reb Aaron, I hope we fulfilled our responsibility in the time limit that you've given me. And I hope we begin to understand this exciting journey that Viduy is not just saying, I'm sorry. Before we say I'm sorry, we have to acknowledge. Before we have to say sorry, we have to admit. And as the Rabbeinu Bachai says, the clarity with which we're able to do it will be the strength of the conviction that we'll have. And please God, all of us, myself at the top of the list, should use these days, which are such blessed days, to prepare ourselves for the day we stand in front of Kodesh Baruch Hu, in order that after that we can truly do the Viduy in a correct way. Thank you for sending in your questions. Should you wish to send me them personally, Rabbi Kirsch at jli.org.uk. Over to you, Reb Aaron.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Rabbi Kirsch, for your share this evening. Apologies again to Rabbi Hartman for the confusion, but I will speak with Rabbi Hartman after. So please God, next week we will be joined by Rabbi Hartman. Thank you very much again, Rabbi Kirsch.
Be blessed and a Ksiva Chasima Tova, truly blessed year, face to face. It's what we're looking forward to. All the very best. Thank you.